So it is often a very customary thing to say that our speaker for today needs no introduction. I think this is particularly true in this case. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Kwok to visit with us today. Dr. Kwok has been a titanic figure in on the scene of global Anglicanism since her writing career began. She came out swinging in the year 2000 with Introducing Asian Feminist Theology. She has significant contributions in Beyond Colonial Anglicanism, which is a piece that I have been assigning in my classes for years and years. She is the author of numerous books, including Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, Hope Abundant, Third World and Indigenous Women's Theology, Postcolonial Politics and Theology, Unraveling Empire for a Global World, Discovering the Bible in the Non-Biblical World as well. And significantly for a scholar, she has always collaborated with her fellow scholars and has produced also numerous edited volumes. There is a wonderful volume whose title I just think is wonderful called Inheriting Our Mother's Gardens. And most recently, Trans-Pacific Political Theology, and another volume, Teaching Global Theology. So several of these will be available for purchase at the book table outside at the end of this lecture. Dr. Kwok has a PhD from Harvard Divinity School. She taught for 25 years at EDS to 2017, but she has also taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Auburn Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary. Among many other honors, she was president of the AAR in 2011. And from 2017, she has been in a position at Emory and at Candler, where she is much beloved and was, I think, at least twice the student-nominated Faculty Person of the Year. And the Dean's Professor of Systematic Theology. But she is now back at EDS, as I understand, as a distinguished scholar throughout this past year and the next. And we are absolutely delighted again to invite her for the Reverend Melissa Kane Memorial Lecture today, Postcolonial Anglicanism and Women's Ministry and Leadership. So I'd like you all to welcome Dr. Kwok.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and for the warm welcome that I have experienced in this Swarmley community. To honor the legacy of the Reverend Melissa Keane, I have chosen to talk about women's leadership and ministry. Now, this picture is taken from last year, and this is a group that I and other colleagues mentored. We call them EDS Fellows. We have 10 different EDS Fellows from different parts of the Anglican Communion, and this is to mentor them to exercise greater leadership in our communion. And in fact, this weekend, I am flying to Nairobi, Kenya, to meet them in person. We have been meeting them online. So I have chosen this photo to begin the conversation. So first of all, I am going to give a presentation on these topics. I want to first talk about postcolonial Anglicanism and why I am into it. And you might want to consider learning from this too. And then I'm going to talk about what I call as a contrapuntal understanding of the Anglican tradition. And moving on to focus on women's ministry and leadership in 4 particular areas. The first area is women's participation and leadership in mission work. The second one will be the long struggle for ordination, and we know that in some parts of the communion, women cannot be ordained, for example, in Southeast Asia. And then women's involvement in addressing gender-based exploitation and violence. And finally, I'm going to talk about the colonial Anglican theological education. So now I want to introduce to you the Hong Kong diocese. And here you can see that on this side, you have my church. My church was built in the 1930s. You did not recognize this as a church. You may think that this is a Buddhist temple because this was built in the Chinese architectural style. The Chinese Anglicans at that time wanted to have a worship space that looked more like Chinese. So this was the Holy Trinity Church. Now it has become a cathedral. And here you can see the inside of the picture. You have the cross. But around the cross, you can see something that you might not have seen elsewhere. Those are the Chinese symbols. And then what are they? And this, in the church, you have both the Christian symbols, the cross, the Trinity, because it's called Trinity Church. But on the other side, you also have thunder, clouds. Those are Chinese symbols. Those are good symbols because you have the thunder, you have the rain, and you have a good harvest. So you have both Christian symbols, Chinese symbols. Here you have the banner of the church on the left-hand side. Can you see the cross? Again, the cross sits on top of a lotus. That is what is called the Nestorian cross. The Buddhists, for them, the lotus symbolizes purity. So you have the cross sitting on top of the lotus, a very special church. We also have the Hong Kong side, the St. John's Cathedral, that will be built in an English colonial style. But this one is Holy Trinity Cathedral. And then I want to introduce to you, when I became a Christian, I was Anglican. And so I went to this Holy Trinity Church. And at that time, when I was a teenager, because my students say, wow, Professor Kwok, when you were a teenager, you have a woman priest? I said, yes. So you can see this was 1971. The Reverend J. Huang Xinyuan was ordained as one of the early priests in my church and in the whole Anglican communion. We will talk about the first one later, the Reverend Florence Lithium Oil, okay? But see, I was there. Can you recognize me? This is me. This one. So I was still a teenager. So I witnessed this great event in the Anglican communion. Because why? We had one earlier, but that one was less recognized, right? Because that was controversial, but this one not controversial, okay? But I will say a little bit about women's struggle for ordination later. And so I give you these two snapshots to talk about how significant this former British colony of Hong Kong would be remembered as the first place that women was ordained. So now I want to talk about why post-colonial Anglicanism. This is the British Empire in 1920s at the height of its imperial expansion. At its peak, the empire covers, as you can see, more than 13 million square miles, around 1/4 of the Earth's total land area, making it the largest empire in history in terms of both population and territory. So this is the British Empire in the 1920s. Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997, closing a period of British colonial history. With colonialism, you have 3 C's. 1, commerce. Remember the East Indian Company? They're doing business in many different parts of the world. You have the colonialism, and also you have the spread of Christianity. Today, this is the map of the Anglican Communion, we always say we have more than 85, but according to other scholars, we have more than 85. We have 90 something million Anglicans around the world, making us the third largest Christian family after the Catholics, the Orthodox, and then the Anglicans. In more than 165 countries. So this is the different provinces. If you ask, how would the Anglican Communion spread so wide and broad? Obviously, it's because of the expansion of the British Empire. Because whenever the crown goes, the saying says, the cross goes as well. So Hong Kong was a colony since 1842, and then British missionaries soon came to evangelize. So in other parts of the world, it's the same story. So you have different mission societies or different churches sending missionary starting churches. So today, we are a global communion is because of the colonial history. But things change in the 20th century in the Anglican history. How so? Now look at this. This is the global distribution of Anglicans. You have the 1900 and then you have 205. In 1900, obviously, the majority of Anglicans lived in UK. But today, even when we are talking about 20 years ago, you have already 55% of Anglicans living on the African continent. And then you have less in Britain and then the rest. And obviously, when we say 33 of the Anglicans lived in Britain, it did not mean they all go to church. As many of you know, if you go to Westminster, you see more tourists than locals. I'm not kidding. I once was at the our Canterbury Cathedral. Wow, the evensong, wonderful. I'm looking forward to the evensong after the talk. And because I always enjoy evensong. And so I was there for 7 days. We all liked this evensong so much. The guest participants all went. But look at behold, oh, we have so few locals again. So now bring it closer. Here we have the two scholars who are very good at the statistics and the quantitative analysis of world Christianity. So here you have the changing demographics of Anglican Communion. On the one hand, you have 1970s. On the other side, you have 2010. Again, you can see the flipping of Europe and Africa. You have, at that time, 59% of Anglicans residing in Africa. But it is also significant to pay some attention to North America. Can you see that? In the 1970s, 49% of Anglicans will be living in the United States and Canada. Today, both the memberships of Anglicans declined in US and Canada. So we make up only 3%, very small percentage of the Anglican Communion. That is why some of the bishops or primates in larger provinces will ask, why should we be listening to the small Episcopal Church or the United or the Anglican Church in Canada, whereas they have so many more people? Now, the demographic change is a significant reason why we have to pay attention to post-colonial Anglicanism. We change the demographics. Today, if we learn very little about African church history and especially African Anglican history, that we are not learning a very comprehensive Anglican communion. We only focus on that tiny minority, 3% of the communion. So I hope during your stay as Wani, you'll get to know African Christianity and also especially Anglican story from Africa. Now I want to remind us, people sometimes say we are not yet post-colonial because the world is still very much under the hegemony of those neo-colonial big empires. Okay, that's true. And that is why whenever I talk about post-colonial, I need to tell them there are two ways of conceptualizing post-colonial. One is after. Post means chronologically after. The other one will be something that we talk more. That is reading strategies, discursive practices, or action to resist empire. So we are keeping that in mind. And Neil Number said post-colonial imagination is the process of disengagement from the whole colonial syndrome. This can be economic, can be political, or cultural and ideological. I also want to highlight that in addition to post-colonial, in academia, we have decolonial theory too. Decolonial theory came more from Latin America, from the Spanish and the Portuguese-speaking folks. And then when they do decolonial, they trace back to their discovery of Christopher Columbus, 15th century, early modern period. So for them, they said, we cannot just talk about the French or the British experience of empire and colonialism. That would be more what the post-colonial have focused. But because I was colonized by the British Empire and then pay more attention to how the British talked about the colonized people, so my work would be associated more with the post-colonial. Here, I need to mention Edward Said, Palestinian-American cultural critic, musician, and also a leading spokesperson for Palestinian rights. He grew up in Jerusalem when he was a younger boy and then left to go to Kairos. Because his family was a very prominent Anglican family in Jerusalem, supporting the work of St. George Cathedral. And so he has been, in his life, influenced by the Anglican Church, went to worship services, and then wrote the definitive book that really kicked off the discussion of post-colonial criticism, that is Orientalism. In that book, he criticized how the Middle East, Orient, the Orient means Middle East, had been portrayed in art, in literature, in missionary text, and in travelogue, and criticizing the representation of the other, in this case, the Arabs, the Middle Eastern people. Later, he also published the book Culture and Imperialism. What I learned most from him is how to use some of his insights to think about or to critique how Anglicanism has expanded and as a field has been studied. So a little after the return of Hong Kong from the British to China, Ian Douglas, a colleague at that time at Episcopal Divinity School, and I convened a conference that talks about Anglicanism from a post-colonial perspective. 2001, we collaborated in editing this book, Beyond Colonial Anglicanism. And then my chapter that talks about cultural hegemony in the Anglican communion may be one of the more often used as a text for different causes. And then 3 years ago, I wrote this book, An Anglican Tradition from a Postcolonial Perspective. I'm happy to report to you that might be the first book by a non-Western female scholar to talk about our tradition. And then last year, together with Bishop Ian Douglas, who then became the Bishop of Connecticut, we collaborated a sequel to our former book, Living Postcolonial Anglicanism, citing examples how in different parts of the communion we have tried to at least live in certain extent to honor the postcolonial insights and dream. We are not yet a postcolonial Anglican communion, far from it, but certainly we want to give some insights how this has been done and can be done. Now, this is how I, or perhaps some of you, have studied the Anglican tradition. Everything is extending from that small British Isles. Whether we are talking about the Episcopal Church or the Canon Church or whatever church, we are an extension of that history. This is central. We are the periphery. This is how Anglican tradition has been taught and has been thought. And that is why we need to have a counter argument. Let me test this. Did you recognize all four? Who is this thin thing? Right? That one, you may or may not know. You see, that was supposed to be Richard Hooker, okay? And so we have Temple, and of course you recognize the king, and then the former archbishop. And so we spend a lot of time learning them. Isn't that true? Oh, the Hookers, the Kramers, okay? The F.D. Morris, okay? Oh, wow. And that is why it is very important and very happy that your own faculty, Bishop Tankentanker, edited the book that talks about post-colonial Anglican theology. Contesting, you cannot just learn Anglican communion about that. You recall that demographic shift. Now they are the minority. You have to learn the majority. That is, people, especially from the global South. We call this contrapuntal reading. That is, you cannot only learn history as if you are paying to one melody. This is Bach's music. Contrapuntal means counterpoint. You have 3 lines. So if you only learn Anglican tradition, the UK one, you only learn one melody. You need now to learn other melodies. In the same time frame, there are other people experiencing Anglicanism that will give you a contrapuntal reading of our own tradition. So today, when we talk about women's leadership, I try to use some of that insights to illustrate how we can have a contrapuntal reading of even women's leadership and ministry. So now, Anglican studies from a postcolonial perspective. The traditional view is from the West to the rest. Everybody is in the periphery, an extension of what happened in UK. The actors, they are the British actors. Others are just passive onlookers, or they just received. They are the receivers. Postcolonial perspective, however, talk about both the local and the global, the contextual and the Catholic in small c, okay? And then you have the particular and the universal. Can you see that? The local, the contextual, the particular will come first. You start from there, and then you see the similarities or the differences across the communion. I want to cite Dana Robert. Why? She is a missiologist teaching at the Boston University Divinity School. More than 20 years ago, she said, the current demographic shift in world Christianity should be analyzed as a woman's movement, based on the fact that even though men are the formal, ordained religious leaders and theologians, women constitute the majority of participants. She was particularly talking about in the Catholic Church and also in the African continent because of the phenomenal growth in Africa, and most of the churches, the majority will be women. Some of you have traveled abroad. You might have visited Anglican churches outside the United States. Did you notice the same thing? Did you meet many churches with the majority are men? No, very few of us encounter those churches. That means, indeed, the Anglican Church is, if it is growing in those places that women are active leaders and participants. Without them, very little growth. And so that is why I want to talk about what did women do and how did they contribute to making the spread of Christianity a women's movement in the 20th century, if not continuing. So first of all, when we look or think about women's leadership, one area we want to talk about is women in mission work. This may be a picture that might come up. The picture is a white missionary working among children or adults of a far away land. What did they do? They would be involved in evangelism, education, health or clinic, or they work in a dispensary. So we will focus the missionary work. At first, they might accompany husbands to go abroad. But later, you also have single women missionaries sent by the society, such as the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel, formed in 1701, one of the earliest mission. And later, you have the CMS, the Church Missionary Society. But from a different perspective, we need to think about the different periods of Anglican mission. The picture we have seen would be only especially the 19th century, sending missionaries, women missionaries now, over there. Jessie Singh, who teaches in Montreal, the Anglican Theological School there. And then in the 70s, 60s, you have the mutual responsibility and independence, and also later partnership in mission. Today, Dr. Singh said mission will be going not only from the West to the West, but everywhere. In many of those multi-ethnic cultural churches, Anglican churches, you have immigrants from many different parts of the world, isn't it? And then, so you will sometimes will have Caribbean pastors coming to Anglican churches to pastor those churches. So it is not a one-side street. It is everywhere. And when we focus on mission work, we cannot just narrowly focus on what the missionaries do. Here, I want to talk about the Bible women, because I have studied the Bible women in China. Who are they? Well, they may get some education from the mission schools or missionaries, and then they went to teach women how to read parts of the Bible, because they need to read some Bible in order to be baptized. Not only that, they will visit them in their homes or visit them in their hospitals. They also became local leaders as well, Bible women, or sometimes you call female evangelists. They would be the one accompanying the women missionaries to travel. Without them, mission work will not do. So from a contrapuntal, you cannot just read that missionaries' women's work without talking about the local people. Then I commend to you this book, Sisters of Spirit, Christianity, Affect, and Community in East Africa, especially in Tanzania. The book talks about, again, the Bible women or the female evangelists in the island just outside in Tanzania, starting their mission work. And afterwards, they also went to Tanzania and other parts in Eastern Africa to do evangelism and helping to organize the women. And so this book talks about not the missionary women, but how local women without much education will be missionaries to other parts of East Africa. So contrapuntally, we cannot just emphasize Western women going to Africa or China without talking about how local women, they also took responsibility in carrying out mission work. Not only that, women organize themselves, both locally and internationally, to continue their mission. One, of course, is the Mothers' Union, which was formed by an English woman in 1876. And then it was quite influential, especially in the African continent. As you can see, they have their uniform. And in some churches, I was told, Dr. Esther Mambo said, they will process during the service. They are not lay people, but they will process. Now, with the Mothers' Union formed in UK, at that time, it was to strengthen motherhood and to help the mothers to carry out their duties as good mothers. But in Africa, and gradually, the mothers' unions assumed more roles. It's not only just promoting motherhood, taking care of children, because of the demands in different countries. The mothers' unions also have helped in other kind of social service and work as well. So today, it will be about 4 million members of the Mothers' Union. We did not hear much in the United States, isn't it? But this is still a very important women-led organization. And then, have you heard about this? You have internationally the International Anglican Women's Network, formed in 1996. Here I list some of their goals, such as promote gender equality, eradicate poverty, hunger, to support women's sustainable economic empowerment. So they will meet, and then the network will have symposium, they have different gatherings, and they have different foci of their work. So both the Mothers' Union and this international network, they are grouping. That is, women from different parts of the communion join. And of course, there are local women's organizations as well. Now, I want to talk about the long history of women's struggle for ordination. First, I want to introduce to you Florence Lithium Oil, who was ordained as early as 1944, fully 3 decades ahead of the so-called irregular ordination of the Philadelphia 11. So 1944. Why that was significant? Well, that was the first time that we have women priests in the Anglican Communion. It was because of the expediency of the war. Hong Kong was occupied by Japan during that time, Second World War. And there was a small part, a place called Macau, that the male clergy needed to go to serve communion. But because of the war, the male clergy could not go. The Reverend Florence Lithium Oil was a deacon in Macau. So then Bishop Hall in Hong Kong decided to ordain her so that the small congregations, the people there, they would be able to have their Eucharist. So the ordination took place in China. And after that, of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury and other bishops did not like the idea. The case was brought to Lambeth, 1948. And then, of course, people gave Bishop Hall a lot of pressure. And so Bishop Hall did not ordain another female priest until 1971, when the deacon that was in charge of my church, Jane Wong and Joyce Bennett, two of them were ordained, 1971. What is good about the story was that the Chinese male clergy supported Reverend Lithium Oil's ordination. So it's good. They were really ahead of time. And so that was 1944. I do not need to repeat to you the situation in Philadelphia 11, because there was even a documentary. Have you seen that? Philadelphia 11. So that was 1974. And then I am so proud to belong to the Diocese of Massachusetts, the first consecrated a woman to be the bishop, Bishop Barbara Harris, 1989. And then, contrapuntally, I want to lift up the story and the images of 6 African women bishops. We used to have 7, but one died, unfortunately, during the COVID years. So we now have 6. In some parts of the world, after this great push of women's ordination, and women can be ordained, then people think, okay, great, now women can be ordained, women can be bishop, women can be primate. We have 2 women primates, one in Wales, one in Brazil. See, we are on an equal footing. Is that true? Certainly not the case. In fact, we need to ask the question whether we have women priests and we have changed the church. In what way we have or have not. Are we still using a common prayer book that would have non-inclusive religious language? And in what way our ministry have been expanded or changed, or has the rather hierarchical and clerical structure of our church changed because of women's ordination? So when I ask these questions, it means that we still have a way to go, isn't it? This may be one symbol of women's gaining leadership and ministry, but as I reminded you, in some parts of the world, women still cannot be ordained. So we still have some way to go. And now I want to talk about women and gender-based violence, especially in the African. These are 2 colleagues from South Africa. One is Beverly Haddad, who has written a lot about this particular issue. On the other side, I have a flyer that talks about a human trafficking conference organized by the International Anglican Women's Network. So gender-based violence. Dr. Esther Mambo from Kenya talks about why we need to talk about colonialism when we talk about gender-based violence. Because she said this colonial legacy and trauma has shaped the many countries in Africa and also former colonies their history. We have seen a lot of ethnic conflict. Because you remember, the African continent was divided in the Berlin Conference, and then it was very arbitrary. So sometimes people of different tribes, they will be divided rather arbitrarily. And so you have ongoing struggle. And then because of this, and you have violence and then ethnic religious strife. So you have the intersection of imperialism and patriarchy. And of course, women suffered during the pandemic, whether it's the AIDS pandemic or the COVID pandemic. And then Beverly Haddad talked about the Anglican Church. She's talking about it some time ago now in South Africa, not as vocal as she had wished, because sexuality is a taboo subject in churches. And that is why the silence, she said, really then caused a lot of deaths, trauma, and mystery. And that is why in South Africa and also in other churches now, we have the Safe Church project, and to especially addressing the question of clergy sexual abuse. And there are resources talking about something that is called redeeming or transformative masculinity, and which is very important because it is not lifting up women's position or power. You need to transform gender relations as well. Citing Jesus and also other parts of the Bible, they want to lift up a transformative masculinity, a masculinity that is not macho, muscular, as we have seen, toxic masculinity in the United States these few years, but rather a masculinity that is respectful of women and as equal partners. So now, I want to talk about theological education to conclude. Here, I introduce to you 3 theological educators from 3 different contexts. Dr. Janet Parr Daniel was the first Indigenous woman, Maori woman, who was the dean of the Maori school in New Zealand. In the middle, you have the Reverend Gloria Mapando. She was the dean of the St. Andrew's Seminary in the Philippines. And then we have Dr. Esther Mumble, who has just been appointed the Vice Chancellor of St. Paul's University near Nairobi. So I want to conclude by talking about the colonial theological education. Last year, I was in Brazil joining a conference that talks about the colonial theological education in the Americas. And so people from North and South America, Central America, we gathered in Brazil for this conference. So in my talk, I talk about the 4 Ds as elements of the colonial theological education. The first is disperse. Why disperse? Because I said theological education cannot just be for those who are preparing for ministry. It needs to be available widely to equip the people of God to carry out the mission of God. So you can have residential school, you can have online program, you also can have other innovative ways of doing theological education. The second one is the disrupt. Disrupt what? Disrupt traditional way of thinking about theological education, including the curriculum, and in our own context, maybe to disrupt the usual way of teaching Anglican studies. I was in Dr. Thompson's class, and then we discussed how this may be done, whether we are giving up the English tradition. I say, no, I long to have a book, Postcolonial Study of Richard Hooker, to look at how Hooker his work because he's a very important figure, right? Or Postcolonial, William Temple. So we look at them contrapunctally, not just from British history, from the perspective of the former colonies. See how they respond to what they have said, okay? To develop new ideas, new approaches, new curriculum that will fit our particular time, and to deepen what? To deepen our spiritual formation. There are many students who told us, we heard it again and again, coming to seminary is really a test of faith. Because we began to ask so many questions, to the extent our bishops wonder whether we can even proclaim the gospel. Hey, wait a minute, Mark 22, chapter whatever. Oh, we have 10 different interpretations. We can preach this sermon. Okay, so to deepen our spiritual formation, and so that it can be a grounding for our learning and for our future mission. And so I hope this presentation talking about post-colonial Anglicanism and lifting up women, especially in the Global South, their contribution to theology, to leadership, to ministry. I have a particular chapter that talks about this in my book, The Anglican Tradition from a Post-Colonial Perspective. So if you want to learn more, I invite you to check that out. Thank you very much. And it's a delight. For your question and comments.
From a small
Yes, we have.
to speak, or?
Yes, we have. Here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Brilliant, fascinating as always. So I've been thinking a lot about, as there are conversations about how to decenter the Anglican Communion's kind of major decision-making structures away from Canterbury and away from England, how they're focused a lot on the four instruments of communion, right? And those four instruments of communion are very Episcopal heavy, right? 3 of the 4 are basically just bishops, and that means that they're also mostly male. And so just thinking about how as we think about this kind of decolonial or post-colonial approach to the communion, and thinking about, I mean, what do we do with that tension, right? Like, we want to decenter this, and yet it's still mostly made up of men who are bishops. And so, what are your thoughts on how we respond to that faithfully, and also lift up women's voices and women's leadership as kind of the majority members of the church, when the majority decision makers, even in this kind of attempted decentering things, are still men?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that is a very important question. And as we speak, we obviously know there is a proposal to change something, which is called the Cairo-Nairobi proposal. And the proposal was regarding the Anglican Conservative Council, because the Archbishop of Canterbury used to be the presiding person. But now they wanted to see if we can divide the Anglican Communion into different regions, and we have rotating leadership calling the conferences. But this still will not answer your question, because still the primates, the rotating presiders, will be mostly male, given that we have only 2 female primates at this time. So, and then within the Anglican tradition, we used to have something called the Anglican Congress. And that is, the lay people will also participate. We had one in Toronto and another one, I think, in other parts of the world. And then in Lambeth, 2022, it was said that hopefully we will have a Congress like that in the Global South. And in that Congress, that is, lay people can also participate in that as well. And obviously, we know the so-called 4 instruments, well, it grew out slowly, isn't it, for various purposes. And it did not mean that it's set in stone, or we can think about are there new ways, number one. Number two, I always think we should not look at power only at the center. We have to look at other forms of linkages, partnership, isn't this? So it's not just we just rely on the primates, okay? And we have other ways of organizing. We have the International Anglican Women's Network. We have the Anglican Indigenous Peoples Network. We have more than those four instruments. So can we also think about if we cannot have a regular Congress because it's very expensive? And can we think about other ways of networking, of forming communion that is not just waiting or always leading the primates or the leaders to speak for us? I think there may be many ways, and I hope with the new female Archbishop of Canterbury, and then maybe something new can happen. And let's hope for that.
Thinking about decolonializing theological education, specifically for the laity, is there anywhere in the Anglican Communion that you see as like representative of a good model of theological lay formation? And if not, what would be your imagining or vision for what that could be and how we could do that better?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that different schools and different parts of the world are doing different things. For example, let me just cite the EDS as an example. We do not have a campus now, and we do not offer regular MDiv or M-Master program. But instead, since the new president was inaugurated, and we have been offering a lot of courses, short courses, webinar that talks about many different kinds of issues. We responded to the Gaza situation with the Anglican Church and Palestine, that webinar. And then the bombing of Iran, we immediately had a webinar that talks about Iran too. I am using this just to say that there are different schools who want to respond to current situations and affecting the United States and the world. And also, I think there is also one way of doing theological education, not in a certificate form, but in a contextual Bible studies. And because in South Africa, we have Professor Gerald West and also Beverly Haddad leading those contextual Bible studies in the congregation. Not teaching them, but listening what they have to say. Very much like the base communities in Latin America. So that is not only in South Africa, it's spread to other African nations and also used at one time at Lambeth too. So they are also raising up new models. Because for us, we think we need to have a school, we need to have established programs to do the colonial theological education. In fact, it may be done in local ways, in more institutional ways, and I hope, given that Zoom is so easy, isn't it? There is no reason why we cannot have Anglican studies across continents and across different schools. And I want to cite an example. During the pandemic, I happened to teach a course on spirituality for Canberra. Canberra has a program that is called Canberra Foundry. And then in that course, I have 13 students who were taking the course from Canberra. But I have 40-something who would be group participants joining from Asia, joining from other parts of the world. My students love it because in real time, they hear what the church in Hong Kong, in Korea, in the Philippines, in Indonesia have been doing for this particular situation, COVID. They said the best part was listening to the international participants. So this may or may not be the model, but I am saying Can we just try so that we can learn a lot about who we are as Episcopalians or Anglicans through other people's eyes, isn't it? So try it out. Form a partnership with a school and learn together. And those may be some of the ways, because contrapunto is talking about epistemology, how we know, why we learn it like that. In the United States, unfortunately, we always put ourselves at the center. We did not have the opportunity of listening what other people have been saying to us, especially in this political climate. We dictate. We want to take control of Greenland. Can you see that? Wow, this is colonial. 19th century colonialism. I could not believe it has been revived. And just in January, 1 month, what did we do, right? And so I think the more I think of it, I think whether it's in institutional level as a school, your church level, I have been invited since publication those books, speaking to seminaries and also local church context to talk about what is postcolonial. Now maybe it's a good time to think about it, given what we are doing to other parts of the world. So I think this is a very, very important question, and think outside the box. The last question, yes.
Many of our students are going in presumably into small church contexts in this country, where, as you say, our horizons are getting, if anything, quite narrow, and where the sort of narrative of church decline makes this horizons even more narrow. It's very tense for you. Why should you teach your congregation that you are part of a community?
Yes, thank you very much. I am glad you asked that question, because I have encountered people who do not know what is their communion, right? Ask. And then number two, there will be people say, why were we talking about postcolonial? They don't have time. Well, I think we are so interconnected, isn't it? The Anglican communion, I see it as a gift. Although it is so difficult to organize ourselves, but isn't it a gift that we belong to one tradition? So that contrapuntal readings will have 165 lines. We are a very rich tradition, if you see it that way. It's really God's gift to us. And if we continue to learn from each other, to network with each other, not only it is important to carry out our mission that way, it will help us to dream, to think about other possibilities. That is number one. Number two, when we say, why should we learn about postcolonial? I say, it is because of this interrelated global situation. When American imperialism is so overt, we really need to have a different pair of lens to think about ourselves. Now, you go to small churches, I know that, and some of these people, they lost their job. Can you not just blame China? Can we also see how the world has changed because of globalization? In fact, that what happened in any small locale cannot be separated with global economics, isn't it? So without seeing why we live in these big global forces, rivalry of big powers, United States, China, and Russia, we may not fully know how those parishioners, they are losing jobs, or why the factories close, why they are in that particular situation. And what I always encourage our students is, do not be bogged down by that narrow vision that you are going to be a clergy of a small church. God called you to go to Swanee, to dream big. I am not saying there's anything wrong with serving a small church, but do not, in your younger days, limit yourself by thinking, I'm just going to be a church leader, a pastor of that rural church somewhere you might have come from. God may call you to do something bigger. And you have to then equip yourself to answer God's calls whenever God calls you. Today, you may serve in a small church. Next day, you may be the canon of the bishop or whatever. Because I have students who are like that. That's why I give those examples. Okay, Stephanie Spellers, who works in the National Church, one of my former students. Can you see that? The world is very complex. God calls you to be global citizens and global leaders. And you better have that long, big dream. Otherwise, you may not be sustained in your ministry. I encourage my women students to read the book, Leaving Church. Have you read that one? Really marvelous, by Barbara Brown Taylor. She left her priesthood in a church, but she is still a priest, but not working in a church, but working in a college. But she was very honest. Why she felt burned out to be a professional holy person, that is as a clergy, writes beautifully. And I think unless we have a bigger vision, sometimes those pragmatics of serving in small communities, they will drain our energy. That is what I encourage you to think. You might be called to different ministries and equip yourself while you are at school, because you never know. God has wonderful things for you. And I am a testimony. My parents were farmers from southern China, not much literate. Lo and behold, her daughter became one of the theologians in the Anglican Communion. And I give thanks to God and God's calling beyond my wildest imagination. So I hope God will call you to do great things. We need you. The world is a dangerous place. Each one of us has to speak up at a time like ours. Thank you very much.
That was exactly right. Thank you very much again. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Do I need to unplug something from something?
Oh, so maybe you're, I'll get your clicker 1 second.
Yes.